Here we are at the Pentagon 9/11 Memorial.
This is where Flight 75 hit the Pentagon. That wall over there. And the corner that was most protected, actually, was the accounting department.
The accounting wing was hit with all the financial records necessary to explain the over-budget and unbudgeted expenses and the missing $2.3 trillion in transactions that Donald Rumsfeld talked about.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
2.3 trillion with a T.
This area is now a memorial and chapel. After a meeting, I went to see it, and as you might expect, it is all about the official story of bin Laden from Afghanistan orchestrating flight hijacking on the other side of the world. In the Hall of Heroes, which was visited by President Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan, you can sign the guest book. The real heroes are the ones who work to bring out the truth about who killed the accountants and other personnel at the Pentagon.
We're at the Pentagon Memorial for 9/11. This is where Flight 75 came across from this angle and hit the Pentagon. And there are many theories about how there is such a smaller than expected hole. And people assume maybe there was no plane at all. But if there was a plane that didn't hit with as much force because it exploded into bits, that's also an explanation. So remember, there are people here who know planes, military people. They could recognize planes. And they also can recognize missiles. So it's very unlikely they would have tried that. The idea was to have a plane to hit the Pentagon to motivate the American public, show it's an active war, and invade Afghanistan and Iraq. So what could have happened is the plane came out and with explosives in the cargo bay exploded just before hitting the Pentagon. That's another explanation that needs to be investigated. Then it would not hit as much with as much force. It would be like hitting with gravel, not like a brick, hitting the wall at the Pentagon, which had also been reinforced just for, apparently, for this event. The plane came over north of Citgo and then slammed into the Pentagon, right about there. At the Pentagon Memorial, the 9/11 Memorial, there's a lot of gravel around. To give us a clue, this is what hit the Pentagon. Fragmented plane. How does a plane get fragmented? By explosives inside. So the plane comes in, and right out here, instead of hitting with the full force of an airplane, it's hit with gravel. So the Pentagon was hit with a gravel-like airplane. Exploded with some kind of ordnance. And of course the military knows a lot about how to explode things.
Now some people, even very smart, have said that there was no debris. But as you can see, there was a lot, especially inside, and scattered across the lawn. But how did this get here? So far from the hole, and laterally. Parts would go straight out the hole. They would go in the southern direction. They wouldn't follow a curved path around towards the west. This means that the part was ejected laterally by the plane exploding outside the wall. This is why the Pentagon is only released about 5 frames from the camera showing the plane impact. Notice the flame gets quickly to the roof. Why? Because the explosion happened just prior to impact and the flame had momentum going from south to north. What is missing is the plane explosion just prior to impacting the wall. I worked as a contractor at the Pentagon, which has anti-aircraft defenses. Why weren't they used?
Welcome to 9/11 Experiments. Experiments you can do yourself to prove or disprove the official conspiracy theory of 9/11. One of the major questions about 9/11 was the small hole in the Pentagon, which has confused people. David Lynch also spoke on that.
And those things for me that bother me is the hole in the Pentagon being too small for a plane. The lawn isn't mussed up, and the government's not showing the plane hitting when many cameras photographed it.
And many PhDs, even in physics and logical reasoning, concluded wrongly that there was no plane at the Pentagon. So why would they conclude that? So it's not that there was no plane at all, but the planes were made smaller somehow. And how could they do that? Explosives. Explosives was a major aspect of 9/11. Hundreds of people saw the planes, and the whole idea of the false flag attack was that planes would hit the building, ostensibly with the hijackers on board. So they don't release photos. Why? Not because there are no planes, but there were fractured planes exploding just prior to hitting the wall of the Pentagon, so that it hits like gravel rather than a brick. There's been a lot of disinformation put out, such as the planes being seen in Cleveland. These are just wild goose droppings that lead people on a wild goose chase. They see a clue, and it's causing just confusion. The perpetrators wanted to confuse the public, potential truth activists, and if they carry it on for 10 years, people start to lose interest. So how can a plane be fractured just before it hits the wall? We'll do an experiment to demonstrate the difference between a plane hitting the Pentagon wall and an equivalent amount of metal. So I got a model. It's 1 to 500 scale, and we'll compare dropping that on a piece of glass symbolizing the Pentagon wall and equivalent amount of metal fractured as if from an explosion. The explosives could have been hidden in the cargo bay, perhaps wings, and this would explain the scattering of the debris all over the lawn, so much that it looked like there was no debris from a distance, but we didn't see the large parts of a plane. Why? Because they were exploded, just timed before hitting the wall of the Pentagon. Why would they want to minimize the damage? Well, it's their building. They don't want to do too much damage to the Pentagon, especially on the side where Rumsfeld and the Joint Chiefs of Staffs were, the opposite side. The side that was hit at the Pentagon was the part that was under construction and had a very solid wall. So it was prepared somewhat for the hitting of a plane, and it would be even more protected if that plane was fractured just prior to hitting the Pentagon wall. So people saw a plane, and they saw a big explosion, but they assumed that the explosion was the plane hitting the wall, which there was some, but there was an explosion just prior to hitting the wall by this hypothesis, so that the plane would hit with less force, because it would be distributed, not into one point, but distributed to many points. So we'll do a demonstration of this. Let's compare the weights of this model of a Boeing 757, the same type that hit the Pentagon, and an equivalent weight of metal, various screws and nuts. Okay, so we'll put the plane, and that's 1.2 ounces. Okay, 1.2 ounces. And we'll take these various pieces of metal, and that's 1.7 ounces. So we could take away a few. I'll tell you what, why don't we leave this amount? So even more weight is going to be hitting the wall, but it's going to be distributed. Okay, so we'll take this glass and we'll support it with these little tape cartridges to symbolize the Pentagon wall. There we go. We're going to compare what happens when we drop this metal plane onto the glass. Compare it with the equivalent mass of nuts, bolts, and broken up mat. Now, my calculations, the speed that this model will attain would be comparable to the speed that the plane was hitting the Pentagon. Now, they say it was about 500 miles an hour, but how do we know unless we see videos of the plane approaching the Pentagon? Some said that the plane went quite slow, but we'll give it a very good speed. First, I'm going to drop this from a distance of 8 feet to the glass. There's 8 feet, right there. Okay? Okay. Now here's the plane hitting when it has exploded. It's approaching the Pentagon wall, then it explodes. So we'll give it. Okay, the glass did not break. So the glass did not break. Shoot it down with a bit more force. Didn't break. We see that the bits of metal hit, but in a distributed way. It was never concentrated on one spot. Okay, now let's try the plane. Hitting intact. Broke. Broke. This time, the plane broke the glass, going at about the same speed as the distributed pieces of metal. In fact, the wing came off of the plane. So this shows that a plane intact, yes, would make a hole, but if it was shattered somehow or exploded into little bits, it would not hit the wall with the same force enough to break it. So this is a hypothesis that should be considered. Okay, let's take a closer look at the items. Here's the plane that came apart, and the glass that was broken when the plane hit with the nose of an intact plane, but not when the plane was dispersed into little parts. That explains the small hole at the Pentagon. It was a fractured plane, not that there were no planes at all. And that's what they are hiding. That's why they don't want to show any videos or photographs of the plane hitting the Pentagon, because it was about to become fractured into many thousands of little bits that scattered across the lawn of the Pentagon, even out to the highway with the force of the explosion. Explosives could have been hit in the cargo bay of the plane, along the wings, on the bottom, in order to produce the effect. So when the plane hit the wall with an intact nose cone, all the force is directed to one point on the wall. But when there are different pieces, they're scattered. One hits here, one hits there, one hits there. It's distributed around the wall, not producing a large hole. That explains why many people say there's a smaller than expected hole. Also, the damage was dispersed very widely over the surface of the wall and onto the grass, even onto the highway. Well, as scientists, we want to practice good lab techniques and cleaning up. The lady of the house might be upset to find this material all over the kitchen. If you do this at home, remember there may be little pieces of glass. You want to be very careful to get every piece, especially if there are children around. You want to get every little piece of glass because they may be walking around barefoot. After that, it's a good idea to mop to get any tiny little pieces of glass. You might get in anybody's foot. Make sure you don't leave any little bits of glass, especially in the kitchen.